The wind in the San Roque Valley did not simply blow, it scoured. It carried the taste of alkali and dried sage, a grit that settled into the seams of clothing and the creases of skin, turning the white cuffs of a shirt brown before noon. Clara Whitlock had been in the valley for 3 months, and she had learned that the dust was not something one cleaned away. It was something one endured, like the heat that shimmered off the hardpan or the silence that stretched between the scrub oaks. She stood on the porch of the small schoolhouse, watching the last of her pupils scatter into the afternoon haze. They were ranch children mostly, sons and daughters of men who looked at the sky with narrowed eyes, searching for rain that had not fallen in 2 years. Clara smoothed the front of her gray calico dress, a habit she had picked up since arriving, as if orderliness could hold back the chaos of the frontier. She was 32 years old, though the mirror in her rented room at the boarding house told her she looked older. Grief had a way of carving lines that time had not yet earned. It had been 18 months since Thomas died, his lungs failing him in a damp room in St. Louis, coughing away the future they had planned. He had left her with a few $100s, a silver pocket watch, and a terrifying freedom. The debts had taken the house, and the need to eat had taken her pride, forcing her west to a place where they did not ask too many questions about a woman traveling alone. San Roque was a town built on optimism and held together by spit. It sat on the edge of the Southern California oil frontier, a place where rumors of black gold circulated like currency, though most men found only dust. The main street was a wide avenue of packed earth, flanked by false-fronted buildings that looked surprised to be there. There was a dry goods store, a livery, 2 saloons that stayed quiet until the sun went down, and a land office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and ink. Clara walked from the schoolhouse toward the center of town, her boots kicking up small puffs of dirt. The townspeople nodded as she passed, but their greetings were thin. To them, she was the widow Whitlock, a woman who had not remarried quickly enough to be respectable, a woman who read too much and spoke with a precision that made the rough-handed men uncomfortable. She sensed their judgment in the way the shopkeepers stopped talking when she entered, a sudden silence that was louder than any whisper. At the corner of Main and First, she saw him. Mateo Reyes was tying a sack of flour to the saddle of a large bay horse. He was a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself, all hard angles and enduring strength. He wore a wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes, and his hands, working the leather thongs of the saddle, were scarred and capable. He was the owner of the Rancho Soledad, a sprawling stretch of land that bordered the town to the north, but he stood apart from the other ranchers. Clara watched him from the shade of the mercantile awning. Mateo was half Mexican in a territory that had conveniently forgotten its history the moment the flag changed. The town tolerated him because his beef was good and his debts were paid, but they did not welcome him. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a quiet defiance that refused to acknowledge the cold shoulders turned his way. A scar ran down the left side of his jaw, a pale line against dark skin, a souvenir of some violence the town whispered about but never named. He looked up, sensing her gaze. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and guarded. He did not tip his hat. He simply held her look for a second, a flat acknowledgement of her presence, before swinging into the saddle and turning his horse toward the north, riding out into the heat without looking back. The environment he rode into was beautiful and cruel. The drought had turned the creek beds into jagged scars of cracked mud. The hills, usually gold in the summer, were the color of bone. Coyotes grew bold, coming down near the corrals at dusk, their yips sounding like manic laughter in the dark. It was a land that demanded payment for every day of survival. Clara turned away, clutching her reticule. In it lay the bank draft that represented everything she had left. She was tired of boarding houses. She was tired of the pity in the eyes of the landlady. She wanted a door she could lock and a piece of earth that answered to no one but her. That evening, the opportunity arrived in the form of Mr. Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man who seemed to glide rather than walk. He wore a suit of checkered worsted wool that somehow repelled the dust, and his smile was a masterpiece of practiced warmth. He found Clara in the parlor of the boarding house, where she was grading slate exercises by the light of a kerosene lamp. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, sweeping his hat from his head, "I hope I am not disturbing your evening. I have a proposition that requires a person of vision." Clara had learned to be wary of charm, but Thorne was different. He was respectful, keeping a proper distance. His voice lowered to a confidential pitch. He spread a map across the small parlor table. It was a beautiful document, drawn in crisp black ink, showing the sweeping lines of the valley. "Here," Thorne said, tapping a long finger on a slender strip of land that ran along the northern ridge. "This is the parcel. It is not large, I grant you, 80 acres. But look where it sits." He traced the line. It bordered the Reyes property, a narrow corridor of land squeezed between the ranch and the public grazing lands. "The railroad is coming south," Thorne whispered. "They need a right-of-way to bypass the steep grade of the pass. This strip, Mrs. Whitlock, is the only level ground for 10 miles. The man who owns this land holds the key to the entire valley transport." Clara looked at the map. She saw the logic in his finger. She saw the potential. But more than that, she saw a deed with her name on it. "How much?" she asked. $500. Thorne said, "A fraction of its worth. But the current owner is back east and tired of paying taxes on it. He wants a quick sale." $500 was nearly every cent she had. It was the buffer between her and destitution. It was the money for a doctor if she fell ill, the money for a ticket back east if she failed. "I need to see it," Clara said. Thorne smiled, a sad, indulgent expression. "I am afraid I have a buyer arriving from Los Angeles on the morning stage." He said, "A gentleman with deep pockets. I came to you first because I believe the land should belong to someone who lives here, someone who contributes to the community. But I cannot hold it past tonight." The pressure sat heavy in the room. Clara thought of the schoolhouse, the dust, the way the town looked through her. Land was permanence. Land was gravity. If she owned this, she would no longer be the drifting widow. She would be a landowner. She would matter. She went to her room and retrieved the envelope from her trunk. Her hands trembled as she counted out the bills. $500. When she handed the money to Thorne, he did not snatch it. He took it reverently, as if receiving a prayer. He signed the bill of sale with a flourish, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "You have made a wise choice." "Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. "A legacy choice." He was gone before breakfast the next morning. The realization did not come all at once. It came in slow, humiliating increments. 2 days later, Clara took her bill of sale to the county clerk's office to have it recorded. The clerk, a man named Abernathy with spectacles thick as bottle bottoms, squinted at the paper and then at her. "Lot 7? Abernathy asked. "You bought Lot 7? "Yes," Clara said, standing straight. "Is there a problem?" Abernathy let out a short, dry chuckle. He looked around the office to see if anyone else was there to share the joke. "No problem for me. Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "but I hope you like goats. That is about the only thing that can stand upright on Lot 7. Clara felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. Mr. Thorne said it was a prime right-of-way for the railroad. She said, the clerk laughed openly then. A harsh sound. "Thorne? That fellow who passed through, ma'am? The railroad survey was finished 3 years ago." "They are going through the San Gabriel Pass, 20 miles east. Lot 7 is a strip of rock and shale on the ridge. It is mostly vertical. You can't farm it. You can't build on it. Hell, you can barely walk on it." Clara stood frozen. The room seemed to tilt. The money. Thomas's money. The security she had bought with her grief. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice sounding very small. Abernathy stamped the paper with a heavy thud. "It is recorded," he said. "It is yours now. Taxes are due in November." The walk back to the boarding house was a blur. The town seemed to know before she even stepped onto the street. News traveled faster than wind in San Roque. She saw heads turn. She saw the smirks, the charming widow, the educated teacher, The woman who thought she was too good for the local bachelors had been swindled like a greenhorn. She heard a woman whisper near the general store. She should have known better. A woman alone has no business buying land. The humiliation was a physical pain, sharp and hot. It was not just the money. It was the confirmation of what the town believed, that she was helpless, that she was foolish, that she needed a man to survive. For 3 days, she did not leave her room except to go to the schoolhouse. She taught her lessons with a rigid back, ignoring the whispers of the older students. But on the 4th day, a Saturday, the anger overtook the shame. She had to see it. She had to see what she had bought. Clara rented a horse from the livery, a placid mare that cost her $2 she could ill afford. She packed a canteen and rode north, following the directions on the deed. The land rose sharply as she left the valley floor, the soil turning from dust to jagged stone. The heat was oppressive, the sun a white hammer against the anvil of the earth. She found the marker stone 2 hours later. It sat at the base of a steep ridge that rose up like a fractured spine. This was it. Lot 7. It was a narrow strip of land, perhaps 100 yards wide, running along the base of the ridge and up the slope. It was covered in chaparral, prickly pear cactus, and loose shale. There was no water. There was no flat ground for a house. It was a scar on the side of the hill. Clara dismounted and stood in the dust. She looked at the worthless rocks. She had traded her freedom for a pile of stones. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. She picked up a rock and threw it as hard as she could at the ridge. It clattered uselessly against the silence. A sound behind her made her spin around. A rider was approaching from the west, coming from the direction of the Rancho Soledad. It was Mateo Reyes. He rode a black gelding that danced nervously on the rocky ground. Mateo pulled the horse up 10 yards from her. He looked at Clara, then at the marker stone, then back at her. His face was unreadable, shaded by his hat, but the tension in his shoulders was clear. "You are the buyer," he said. It was not a question. His voice was deep, rough with the unused quality of a man who spent days without speaking. Clara lifted her chin. She would not let him see her cry. "I am," she said. Mateo shifted in his saddle. He looked at the narrow strip of land that bordered his own fence line. "Who are you working for?" he asked. Clara frowned, wiping the dust from her forehead. "I beg your pardon?" "Don't play games," Mateo said. His voice hardened. "That strip is useless. No one buys it unless they want to cut my cattle off from the upper drift or force a dispute on the boundary. Is it the Miller brothers? Or the Land Water Company?" Clara stared at him. He thought she was a predator. He thought she was part of some scheme to hurt him. The irony was so bitter she almost laughed. "I am working for myself, Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I bought this land because I was told it was an investment. I was told the railroad was coming." Mateo studied her. He looked at her dusty dress, her rented horse, the desperate set of her jaw. The suspicion in his eyes did not vanish, but it shifted. He knew the land. He knew the lies men told about it. "The railroad," he repeated flatly. "Yes," Clara said. He looked up at the ridge, then down at her. "There is no railroad," he said. "The man who sold you this sold you wind." "I know that," Clara snapped. "I know that now." Mateo sat silently for a long moment. The wind whistled through the cactus between them. He saw the flush of humiliation on her cheeks, but he also saw that she was standing her ground. Most people, finding they had been cheated, would be weeping. She was throwing rocks. "You spent your money on this." He said, "Every cent." Clara said, "Why?" "Because I wanted something that was mine." She said, her voice broke, just once, but she caught it. "I wanted something that could not be taken away." Mateo looked at her hands. They were clenched into fists at her sides. He knew that feeling. He knew the hunger for a place to stand where no one could tell you to move. He had spent his whole life fighting for the land his grandfather had been granted, fighting lawyers and squatters and a town that wished he would vanish. He saw the loneliness in her, a vast and hollow thing that matched the empty sky above them. And for a moment, The wall he kept between himself and the world lowered just an inch. "It is bad land, Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "but it is land." He turned his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking. "Watch out for the sidewinders in the rocks," he added. "They like the heat." He touched the brim of his hat, a small, reluctant gesture of respect, and kicked his horse into a trot, riding back toward his fence line. Clara watched him go until he was just a silhouette against the blinding sun. She turned back to her property. The shadows were lengthening, turning the canyons into pools of purple and black. The coyotes would be waking soon. She stood on the rocky slope, her boots sliding in the shale. She owned this. It was ugly, broken, and barren. It was a joke played on a desperate woman, but as she looked at the hard earth, she felt a strange, cold resolve settle in her chest. She had nothing left to lose. The town expected her to pack her bags. They expected her to vanish in shame, to run back east and admit defeat. Clara Whitlock reached down and picked up a handful of dirt. It was dry and gritty, but it was real. She crushed it in her palm. "No," she whispered to the empty valley. She would not run. She would not give them the satisfaction. If this rock was all she had, she would hold on to it with both hands. She would stay, and she would make them see her. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first star appeared, sharp and cold. Clara mounted her horse and turned back toward town, the dust swirling around her like a promise of a fight to come. The contest for Clara Whitlock's dignity took place in the county clerk's office, a room that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. The clerk, Mr. Abernathy, sat behind a desk that seemed designed to act as a fortress, his spectacles sliding down a nose that was perpetually slick with perspiration. He held Clara's deed as if it were a soiled handkerchief, pinching the corner between his thumb and forefinger. "I am telling you, Mrs. Whitlock, the survey lines on this document are antiquated," Abernathy said. His voice carried a tone of bored condescension that Clara was learning to recognize as the default language of men in power when speaking to women without husbands. "They are not antiquated," Clara said, keeping her voice level despite the thrumming of her pulse. "They are copied directly from the county master map of 1885. I checked the reference numbers myself." Abernathy dropped the paper onto the desk. He leaned back, lacing his fingers over his vest. "Maps change," he said. "The territory changes. You have purchased a parcel that legally exists, I suppose, but the boundaries are fluid. If you intend to fence it, you will need a new survey, and surveys cost money. I have the right to validate the existing claim without a new survey if the markers are found." Clara insisted. "That is the law." Abernathy sighed. A long, rattling sound. "The law is a complex instrument, ma'am. It is not something to be navigated by a lady alone. Surely there is a brother, or perhaps a suitor, who could handle these heavy matters for you. It disturbs the natural order to see a woman distressing herself over boundary stones and shale." Clara felt the heat rise in her neck, a flush of anger that she willed down. She placed her hands flat on the desk, leaning forward until she forced Abernathy to blink. "My distress is not your concern, Mr. Abernathy," Clara said. "My property rights are. I will locate the markers myself if I must. Until then, you will keep this deed on the active register. Do I make myself clear?" Abernathy picked up his pen, scratching at his ear with the feather end. "As crystal, Mrs. Whitlock, but do not blame me when the desert swallows your investment whole." While Clara fought her battle with ink and paper, Mateo Reyes was fighting a different war in the dim corner of the Gem Saloon. He did not drink spirits during the day, but the summons from Mayor Higgins had been framed as a matter of urgent town business. Mateo sat with a glass of tepid water before him, watching the mayor and the town banker, Silas Pruitt, pretend to be his friends. Higgins was a large man who sweated profusely, his face red and shiny. Pruitt was his opposite, dry and skeletal, a man who looked as though he had never sweated in his life. "We are just thinking of the community, Mateo," Higgins said, wiping his forehead with a yellow silk rag, "and of the poor woman. It is a tragedy. Truly, a widow, swindled out of her savings by a grifter. It reflects poorly on San Roque. It reflects poorly on the man who sold it, Mateo said, his voice low. Yes, yes, of course. Pruitt cut in. But she is stuck with it. 80 acres of rock right up against your north fence. It is a nuisance for you, is it not? Having a woman scrambling around your borderline. Mateo took a slow sip of water. He knew exactly where this was going. She has not bothered me, he said. Not yet, Higgins said, leaning in. But she will. She is desperate. Desperate people do foolish things. They cut fences. They steal water. We want to solve this problem for everyone. Pruitt slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a bank draft. We are prepared to offer you a loan, interest-free, to buy the parcel from her, Pruitt said. Offer her $50. It is charity. Really, enough for her to buy a ticket back to wherever she came from. You get the buffer land to secure your northern grazing, the town gets rid of an embarrassment, and the widow gets a graceful exit. Mateo looked at the draft. $50. She had paid $500. They wanted him to be the instrument of her final humiliation. They wanted him to drive her out so they could stop feeling guilty about watching her fail. Why me? Mateo asked. Why not buy it yourselves? Higgins laughed nervously. Well, coming from us, it might look like business. Coming from you, her neighbor, it looks like kindness. A favor from one rancher to a failed one. Mateo looked at the two men. He saw the calculation in their eyes. They did not care about Clara Whitlock. And they certainly did not care about a half-Mexican rancher. They were using him to clean up a mess so the town could go back to pretending it was a civilized place. He thought of Clara standing in the dust 2 days ago, throwing rocks at the mountain. He thought of her refusing to cry. $50 is an insult, Mateo said. It is $50 more than that rock pile is worth. Pruitt snapped. Mateo stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floorboards, silencing the nearby conversation at the bar. He towered over the table, his presence suddenly filling the small space. I will not do your dirty work, he said. If you want to drive her out, you do it, but do not ask me to steal from a woman who has already been robbed. He turned and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving the mayor and the banker staring at his back. He knew, with a heavy certainty, that his refusal had just cost him whatever thin tolerance the town council had for him. He had chosen the side of the outsider, and in San Roque, that was a dangerous place to stand. Clara, unaware that her fate was being debated in saloons, was following a thread of ink. After her encounter with Abernathy, she had gone to the telegraph office, spending precious coins to send inquiries to Los Angeles and Bakersfield about the man named Elias Thorne. The replies had trickled in over the last week, and they painted a picture that chilled her blood. Elias Thorne did not exist, but a man fitting his description, a smooth talker in a checkered suit, had been seen in the company of men from the Pacific Geo Trust, a shadow syndicate known for aggressive land acquisition in the Central Valley. Clara sat in her room, piecing the puzzle together. Why would a syndicate sell her land? If the land was valuable, they would keep it. If it was worthless, why go to the trouble of a complex swindle? The answer came on a Tuesday night, carried on the wind. Smoke. The alarm bell rang out from the church tower, a frantic, clanging rhythm that pulled the whole town from their beds. The fire was at the old Mission San Roque, a crumbling adobe structure on the edge of town that served as a makeshift archive for county records that predated the American occupation. Clara ran with the others, joining the bucket line that stretched from the horse trough. The air was thick with ash and the smell of burning history. The fire was small but fierce, eating through the dry timber of the roof in the archive room. "Save the books," Father Costello shouted, his cassock stained with soot. "The records." Clara did not hesitate, while the men fought the flames with water. She wrapped her shawl around her face and ducked under the smoking lintel. The archive room was an oven. Shelves of leather-bound volumes were beginning to curl in the heat. She grabbed armfuls of books, journals, and rolled maps, running them out to the safety of the courtyard. She went back 3 times, her eyes stinging, her lungs burning. until a timber crashed down and a pair of hands grabbed her waist, hauling her back. "That is enough." "Mrs. It is too dangerous." It was the blacksmith who held her, but Clara pulled away, dropping to her knees beside the pile of salvaged documents. She spent the rest of the night guarding them, wiping soot from the vellum covers as the fire died down to glowing embers. In the gray light of dawn, as the townspeople drifted away, Clara began to sort through the chaotic pile she had saved. She opened a scorched leather portfolio, its edges black and crumbling. Inside were maps drawn by the Franciscan friars in the 1820s, and later notes added by early American surveyors in the 1850s. One map caught her eye. It depicted the northern ridge, the very ridge that crossed her land and Mateo's. She squinted at the faded ink. The topography was familiar, but there were notations she had never seen on the modern maps. Small crosses marked along the fault line, and a phrase written in elegant, looping Spanish script, "Ojo de Brea, Eye of Tar," beneath it, in a cramped, hurried English hand from a later decade. Someone had written, "Seepage heavy in summer heat, black earth combustible, potential vast." Clara stopped breathing for a moment. She looked at the date on the English note, 1852. Then she looked at the signature. It was illegible, smeared by time or water. Thorne had not sold her the land because it was worthless. The syndicate had used her. They had needed a placeholder, someone to hold the deed while they maneuvered to acquire the larger prize. Mateo's ranch. If they bought the land directly, prices would skyrocket. But if they sold it to a desperate widow, they could buy it back later for pennies, along with everything around it, once they had squeezed the neighbors out. The land was not a trap, it was a vault, and she held the key, but she could not unlock it alone. She did not know the terrain, she did not know the signs of the earth. She needed someone who knew the ridge as well as he knew his own face. She needed Mateo Reyes. The ride to Rancho Soledad took an hour. Clara rode with the map tucked inside her blouse, against her skin. When she arrived, Mateo was in the corral, breaking a young colt. He saw her coming and walked to the fence, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not smile, but he did not tell her to leave. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "you are a long way from the schoolhouse." Clara dismounted. Her legs were shaking, not from the ride, but from the weight of what she had to say. "I found something," she said. "In the mission fire." Mateo watched her, his expression unreadable. "I heard you were a hero last night," he said. "Running into the flames." "I was not being a hero," Clara said. "I was looking for answers, and I found one." She pulled the map from her blouse and spread it on the top rail of the fence. The wind tugged at the corners. Mateo looked down at it. She saw his eyes narrow as he recognized the landmarks. "Ojo de Brea," Clara read aloud. "Do you know what that means?" Mateo nodded slowly. "Tar spring. Have you ever seen tar on your land?" Clara asked. Mateo hesitated. He looked at the ridge that loomed behind the ranch house. "There are stories," he said. "My grandfather used to say the Indians used the black mud to seal their baskets. But I have never seen a spring. Just stains on the rocks." Clara pointed to the English note. "Potential vast," she said. "The syndicate knows it is there. That is why they use Thorne. That is why the town wants you to buy me out cheap. They are trying to clear the board before they make their move." Mateo looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the soot still smudged under her jaw, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He realized that she was not asking for help. She was offering an alliance. "If this is true," he said, his voice low, "we are sitting on a powder keg. If they know about the oil, they will not stop at fraud. They will burn us out if they have to." "I know," Clara said. "That is why we have to be sure. I need you to take me there. I need to see the Ojo de Brea." Mateo looked at the map, then at the distant, jagged spine of the ridge. It was dangerous terrain, brutal and unforgiving, and being seen there with her would only fuel the fires of gossip that were already smoldering in town. But looking at Clara, standing straight in the dust, he found he could not say no. "Be ready at dawn tomorrow," he said. "Wear boots that can handle shale, and bring water." a lot of it. The trek began before the sun had fully breached the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. They rode as far as the horses could manage, then tied them in a scrub oak grove and continued on foot. The land was an adversary. The heat rose quickly, radiating off the stones until the air shimmered. They climbed through tangles of manzanita that tore at their clothes and scrambled over loose scree that threatened to slide them back down the mountain with every step. Mateo moved with an efficiency that Clara envied. He found footholds where she saw only smooth rock. He paused often, waiting for her to catch up, but he never offered a hand unless she was truly stuck, respecting her enough to let her climb under her own power. They spoke little. The effort of the climb took all their breath, but in the silence, a rhythm formed. They were a team, bound by the shared secret of the map. By noon, they reached the coordinates marked by the Spanish friar. It was a depression in the ridge, hidden by a thicket of dry brush. The smell hit them first, a heavy, sulphurous odor that cut through the scent of sage. Mateo used a machete to hack away the brush. Behind the screen of gray branches, the rock was stained a deep, glossy black, and there, oozing from a fissure in the earth like a slow, dark wound, was a trickle of thick, sticky liquid. It pooled in a natural basin of stone, shimmering with a rainbow's sheen in the sunlight. Clara knelt beside it. She touched the black substance with her fingertip. It was warm and tacky. She rubbed it between her fingers. It smelled of ancient earth and raw power. "It is real," she whispered. Mateo stood over her, scanning the horizon. He did not look at the oil. He looked at the vulnerability of their position. "It is real," he agreed, his voice tight. "And it crosses the line. This pool is on my side, but the dip of the rock suggests the dome goes under your strip." He crouched down beside her. For the first time, the distance between them vanished. They were two people staring into the throat of a monster that could make them kings or kill them. "We cannot let them know we found this," Mateo said. "If the syndicate finds out we have confirmed the strike, they will move against us immediately." Clara wiped her hand on the rock. "They already suspect," she said. "That is why the pressure is mounting. Mateo, we have to fight them." It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her, startled by the intimacy of it, and by the fierceness in her face. "We will fight," he said, "but we fight carefully." The return trip was harder. The euphoria of discovery had faded, replaced by the weight of the danger. When they rode back into the outskirts of town late that afternoon, the sun was low, casting long, accusing shadows. They did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, was sweeping her porch as they passed. She stopped, leaning on her broom, her eyes tracking them with malicious delight. Clara saw the curtains twitch in the windows of the boarding house. The whispers began before the dust had settled. She was with him all day, alone, up in the hills. The narrative shifted from the foolish widow to the scandalous woman. They said Mateo was using her, that he was taking advantage of her desperation to expand his ranch. They said Clara was selling her virtue for a roof over her head. The prejudice against Mateo, always a low hum, rose to a shout. He was no longer just the outsider. He was the predator. That night, Clara did not go back to the boarding house. She could not face the landlady's pursed lips. Instead, she stayed at the ranch, in the small guest room that Mateo's mother had once used. They sat in the main room of the ranch house, a simple, sturdy space with whitewashed adobe walls and heavy wooden beams. A fire crackled in the hearth, fighting the chill of the desert night. Mateo poured 2 cups of coffee, strong and black. They sat at the table. The map spread out between them again, but they were not looking at the map. "They are going to try to ruin you," Clara said softly. "Because of me?" Mateo swirled his coffee. "They have been trying to ruin me since I was born." He said, "My father was American. My mother was Mexican. To the Americans, I am a Mexican. To the Mexicans, I am a gringo. I am used to not fitting in their boxes." He looked at Clara. "But you are not used to this. You are a lady. You had a place in the world. I had a place in a world that is gone. Clara said. She looked down at her hands, still stained with the faint residue of the oil. I was a teacher. I was a wife. Now I am just the woman who got scammed. She looked up, and her eyes were wet. I was so ashamed. Mateo. When I realized what I had done, I felt like a child who had lost her penny. I thought I was so smart, so independent, and I walked right into their trap. Mateo reached across the table. He did not take her hand, but he covered it with his own, his palm rough and warm against her skin. You are not a child, he said, and you are not a fool. A fool would have run away. You stayed. You climbed that ridge. His thumb brushed the back of her hand. The touch was electric, startling them both. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin, very charged. Clara looked at him, seeing the man beneath the reserve. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the loneliness that mirrored her own. She saw a man who had built a fortress around himself to survive, just as she was trying to do. Mateo. She breathed. He leaned in, drawn by a gravity he could not name. His face was inches from hers. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the texture of the scar on his jaw. She could smell the sage and leather and the faint, smoky scent of the fire. It would be so easy to close the distance, to let the fear and the adrenaline resolve into something softer, something they both starved for. But Mateo pulled back. He withdrew his hand, his jaw tightening. He stood up, walking to the window. I cannot, he said, his voice rough. I cannot do that to you. If I touch you, the town will destroy you completely. They will say every lie they invented is true. Clara stood up. She wanted to tell him she didn't care about the town. She wanted to tell him that his respect meant more to her than their politeness. But she knew he was right. They were walking a knife's edge. One slip, and they would both fall. We should sleep, she said, her voice trembling. We have work to do tomorrow. Mateo nodded, not turning around. Good night, Clara. Good night, Mateo. The silence of the house settled around them, heavy with things unsaid. Outside, on the ridge overlooking the ranch, a shadow moved. A man lowered his field glasses, the moonlight glinting briefly on the lens. He was dressed in the dark coat of a city man, but he sat his horse like a cavalry scout. He had seen them on the ridge that afternoon. He had seen the way they moved together, and he had seen them enter the ranch house and not come out. He turned his horse and began the slow ride back to town. The syndicate would be interested to know that the widow and the rancher were no longer just neighbors. They were partners, and partners were dangerous. The time for buying them out was over. The time for breaking them had begun. The assault began not with guns, but with paper and silk. 3 days after Clara Whitlock and Mateo Reyes stood over the seeping wound of the earth on the high ridge, the Pacific Geo Trust made its move. They did not come as a single force. They came as a hydra, splitting their heads to strike at 2 different throats. For Clara, the attack arrived in the form of Mr. Frederick Sterling. He came to the schoolhouse just as she was dismissing the children for the noon meal. Sterling was a different breed than the ghostly Elias Thorne. Thorne had been a grifter, a man of cheap suits and cheaper smiles. Sterling was oak and iron, dressed in a black frock coat that absorbed the sun, carrying a briefcase of polished cordovan leather. He waited by the hitching post, watching the children run past him. When Clara emerged, wiping chalk dust from her hands, he tipped his hat with a precision that felt more like a blade being drawn than a greeting. Mrs. Whitlock, Sterling said. His voice was a rich baritone, the kind of voice that sounded reasonable even when it was lying. I represent a consortium of investors from San Francisco. I believe we have mutual interests. Clara stood on the porch, feeling the dry wind lift the hem of her skirt. She knew who he was. She had seen men like him in St. Louis, men who spoke of progress while they carved up the world for profit. I am not selling, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, cutting him off before he could begin his preamble. Sterling chuckled, a low, indulgent sound. He walked up the steps, invading her space with practiced ease. Come now, Clara. May I call you Clara? We are all adults here. You bought a patch of rock from a charlatan. You have been embarrassed. The town laughs at you. My employers are sensitive to your plight. They wish to correct this error." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. It was a deed transfer, already drafted. Beside it, he placed a bank draft. $1,000, Sterling said. Clara stared at the paper. $1,000. It was double what she had paid. It was enough to leave San Roque. It was enough to return to the east, to buy a small cottage, to disappear into a life of quiet, respectable widowhood where no one knew she had been a fool. For a heartbeat. The temptation was so strong it made her knees weak. She could end the struggle. She could sleep through the night without the gnawing fear of poverty. But then she remembered the black pool on the ridge. She remembered the heat of the stone and the look in Mateo's eyes when he touched the earth. "If the land is worthless rock," Clara said, her voice steadying, "why would you pay double its value?" Sterling's smile did not waver, but his eyes grew cold. "We are building a future, Mrs. Whitlock. We need the right-of-way for pipelines, for access roads. Your little strip is a pebble in our shoe. We are paying you to remove the pebble." "It is not a pebble," Clara said. "It is a key. And I think the lock it opens is worth a great deal more than $1,000. Sterling snapped the briefcase shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet schoolyard. "You are listening to the wrong people," he said softly. "You are listening to a half-breed rancher who thinks he can stand in the way of industry. Do not mistake our generosity for weakness. If you do not take this offer, the next one will be zero. And by then, you will be begging us to take the land." Clara gripped the railing of the porch. "I believe our business is concluded," she said. Sterling touched the brim of his hat. "For today," he said, while Sterling was laying his trap of gold. The syndicate sent a different messenger to the Rancho Soledad. Mateo was repairing a section of fence along the creek bed when two riders approached. They did not ride the hired nags of the livery. They rode heavy, corn-fed quarter horses, the kind used by stock detectives and regulators. Mateo did not stop working. He twisted the wire tight with his pliers, the metal biting into the cedar post. He felt the weight of the Colt revolver on his hip, a heavy reassurance he had started carrying again since the fire at the mission. The riders stopped 10 feet away. One was a man Mateo knew by reputation, Jack Silas, a regulator who had worked for the cattle barons in Wyoming during the range wars. He had eyes like flint and a smile that showed too many teeth. "Afternoon. Reyes," Silas said. Mateo turned slowly. He wiped the sweat from his eyes with his forearm. "Silas." "We bring greetings from the association," Silas said, leaning on his saddle horn. "They are worried about you. They hear you are getting distracted, spending time on rock piles instead of tending to your beef." "My beef is fine," Mateo said. Silas looked around the ranch, his gaze lingering on the barn, the water tower, the house. "It is a dry year," Silas said. "Things catch fire easily. Cattle get sick. Fences get cut. A man needs friends in times like these. The association wants to buy your northern range, the rocky part. It is not for sale," Mateo said. Silas sighed. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry earth near Mateo's boot. "That is the wrong answer. Friend, you see, the law is a tricky thing. Sometimes it protects a man. Sometimes it forgets he exists. You do not want to be forgotten, do you? Not with your history." Mateo stepped forward, the wire cutter still in his hand. "Get off my land," he said. Silas laughed, but he backed his horse up a step. "We are going. But think on it. Reyes, the widow cannot save you. She will sell the moment the heat gets high, and then you will be all alone." The war of nerves escalated the next morning. Sheriff Vance, a man with a heavy gut and a conscience light enough to be bought for the price of a poker stake, rode out to the Rancho Soledad. He did not come to investigate the threats. He came to inspect the brand records. He spent 4 hours going through Mateo's books, questioning every calf, every sale, every transfer. He measured the height of the loading chute, claiming it was 2 inches below the county safety ordinance. He fined Mateo $50 for improper disposal of manure near the creek. a violation that every rancher in the valley committed daily without consequence. It is just the law. Mateo, Vance said, handing him the citation. We have to be vigilant. Mateo took the paper, his face a mask of stone. He knew what this was. It was the death of 1,000 cuts. They would drain his money with fines, tie him up with bureaucracy, and exhaust him before the first shot was fired. Meanwhile, Clara found herself standing before a judge in the county seat. The syndicate had filed a motion challenging the validity of her deed. Their lawyer, a man with a voice like dry leaves, argued that the original Spanish land grant from 1840 had been partitioned incorrectly in 1872. They claimed that Clara's strip, Lot 7, was a clerical error, a phantom parcel that existed on paper but overlapped with the public grazing trust. It was a lie. Clara knew it. The map she had saved proved it. But the law was not about truth. It was about procedure. Judge Miller, a man who dined frequently with the investors from San Francisco, looked over his spectacles at Clara. This is a complex matter, Mrs. Whitlock. Miller said, the provenance of this land is murky until a full survey can be conducted by a court-appointed engineer. The title is considered under dispute. You may not build, dig, or alter the terrain. But that could take months, Clara protested. The wheels of justice turned slowly. Madam, Miller said, next case. Clara walked out of the courthouse into the blinding sun. She felt the trap snapping shut. They were not just trying to steal the land. They were freezing her out. They knew about the oil. They knew that if she could not dig, she could not prove the strike. And if she could not prove the strike, she would starve before the court ever heard her case. She met Mateo that evening at the edge of town, in the shadow of an old oak tree where they would not be easily seen. The stress was etched into his face, deepening the lines around his mouth. They find me again, Mateo said, and they are holding my cattle shipment at the railhead. Quarantine inspection. They say my steers might have ticks. It is a siege, Clara said. She told him about the court order. They are trying to bleed us dry. Mateo looked toward the darkening hills. We need to bind the land, he said. If your deed is shaky, we anchor it to mine. What do you mean? Mateo drew a line in the dirt with a stick. We sign a boundary agreement, a formal contract stating that we mutually recognize the property line and that we share water and mineral rights along the border. If they attack your deed, they have to attack mine. And my deed comes from the Mexican government, ratified by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It is older than their state laws. Clara looked at him. It was a brilliant, desperate strategy. It would tie his fate irrevocably to hers. If she went down, he went down. Mateo, she said softly, if we do this, there is no going back. You will be carrying my target on your back. He looked at her, his dark eyes fierce. I am already carrying it. Clara, we are in this. They signed the papers 2 days later, witnessing each other's signatures in the back room of a notary who was too drunk to care who they were. But the legal maneuver did not stop the social rot. Sunday morning brought the cruelty of the town into the light. Clara walked to the small white church, as she did every week. She wore her best dress, her head held high, but as she walked up the aisle, the sea of bonnets and Sunday suits parted. No one spoke, no one nodded. Women she had taken tea with turned their backs. The choir director, Mrs. Higgins, pointedly moved her music stand to block Clara's view. The sermon was about the sanctity of the natural order and the dangers of greed and loose morals. The Reverend did not use her name, but he did not have to. Every word was a stone thrown in her direction. When the service ended, Clara walked out alone. She stood on the steps, waiting for someone, anyone, to say good morning. Nothing. Just the sound of wind and the rustle of skirts moving away from her. She felt the tears pressing behind her eyes, hot and stinging. The isolation was a physical weight, crushing the air out of her lungs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run to Sterling and take the $1,000 and leave this hateful, dusty hell. She walked home, her vision blurred. Why was she fighting? For a patch of rocks? For a man who could barely look her in the eye because he was so afraid of ruining her further. That night, the violence shifted from the soul to the flesh. It was 2 hours past midnight when the sound of bellowing cattle woke Mateo. It was a sound of distress, a low, panic-stricken lowing that echoed off the canyon walls. Mateo pulled on his boots and grabbed his rifle, running out into the dark. The moon was hidden by clouds, the night thick and suffocating. He ran toward the south pasture, where the main herd was penned near the water trough. The smell hit him first, the sharp, chemical stench of coal oil. He reached the trough and struck a match. The water was slick with an iridescent film. Someone had poured gallons of kerosene into the supply. The cattle were milling around, thirsty but terrified by the smell, but the silence from the upper corral was what chilled his blood. He ran to the supply pipe that brought water from the spring. It had been hacked apart with an axe. The water was soaking into the thirsty dust, mud forming a useless puddle where the lifeblood of the ranch should have been flowing. Mateo fell to his knees, trying to stem the flow with his hands, but the pipe was shattered. They had cut the water. In a drought, this was not vandalism. It was an assassination attempt. He spent the next hour in a frenzy, driving the cattle away from the poisoned trough, opening the gates to the dry creek bed in the hope they might find a muddy pocket. When dawn broke, the devastation was clear. The main water supply was gone. The reserve tank had been drained. He had 300 head of cattle and no water. Clara arrived at sunrise. She had seen the commotion from the road on her way to school. She did not go to the schoolhouse. She turned her horse and galloped up the ranch drive. She found Mateo by the barn, covered in mud and oil. He was slumped against the wheel of a wagon, his head in his hands. He looked broken. "Mateo!" Clara cried, sliding from her saddle. He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mask of exhaustion and rage. "They poisoned it," he rasped. "They poisoned the water." Clara did not ask questions. She saw the cut pipe. She smelled the kerosene. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Maybe 2 days," Mateo said, "before they start dying of thirst. I have to move them to the seep at the North Canyon, but it is 5 miles over the ridge. The calves will not make it. We will make them make it," Clara said. She took charge. The schoolteacher vanished, and the frontier woman emerged. She organized Mateo's 2 remaining ranch hands, terrifying them into obedience with her sharp commands. She turned the kitchen into a supply station, boiling water from the kitchen pump, the only clean source left, to wash the kerosene from the muzzles of the cattle that had tried to drink. She worked side by side with Mateo all day. They hauled buckets. They patched the pipe with canvas and tar, a temporary fix that barely held. They drove the herd, shouting and waving hats, pushing the beasts up the rocky incline toward the distant spring. The sun beat down on them without mercy. The dust coated their throats. Clara's hands were blistered, her dress torn, her hair falling loose from its pins. But she did not stop. And because she did not stop, Mateo could not stop. By sunset, the herd was at the North Spring. It was a trickle, but it was enough to keep them alive. They rode back to the ranch house in the dark, their bodies aching, their minds numb. The kitchen was quiet. Clara pumped water into a basin. She washed her face, the cool water feeling like a benediction. She handed the wet rag to Mateo. He took it, wiping the grime from his neck. He looked at her. She was pale, her eyes dark with fatigue. Dirt smudged on her cheek. "You should not be here," Mateo said. His voice was a wreck. "You should be in town. You should be safe." "Safe?" Clara laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "There is no safe. Mateo, there is only this." She gestured to the dark window, to the land out there that wanted to kill them. "They tried to destroy you today," she said, "and they failed." Mateo dropped the rag. He took a step toward her. The adrenaline of the crisis was fading, leaving behind a raw, shaking need. "You saved me," he whispered. "I would have given up. When I saw the pipe, I was done." "No," Clara said. "You would not have given up. You just needed someone to carry the bucket." She looked up at him. The air in the kitchen changed. It was no longer the air of crisis. It was the air of two people who had looked death in the face and were amazed to find themselves still breathing. The distance that had always been there, the distance of propriety, of race, of fear, evaporated. Mateo reached out and touched her face. His hand was rough, calloused, shaking slightly. "Clara," he said. It was a question and a confession all at once. Clara leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes. Letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. "It is okay," she whispered. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of a romance novel. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and dust and exhaustion. It was the collision of two lonely orbits. Mateo's arms went around her, pulling her against him as if he were trying to merge their broken pieces into something whole. Clara held on to him, her hands gripping the back of his shirt. She felt the solid muscle of his back, the beating of his heart against her chest. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt anchored. She was not floating in the void. She was here. They broke apart slowly, resting their foreheads together. "I am scared," Clara admitted softly. "I know," Mateo said. "I am too, but the fear was different now. It was not the paralyzing fear of the morning. It was the fear of having something precious to lose. They sat at the kitchen table as the night deepened. They did not speak of love. That word was too small, too clean for what was happening between them. They spoke of strategy. "We have to attack," Clara said. "We cannot just defend." "How?" Mateo asked. "The law is bought, not all of it." Clara said, "I have been writing. I have been documenting everything. The dates, the threats, the fire, the brand inspections, the water." She pulled a notebook from her satchel. It was filled with her neat, precise handwriting. "This is a dossier," she said. "It is a record of a conspiracy. If we can get this to a federal judge, someone outside the county, someone in Sacramento or San Francisco, we can bypass the local courts. We can ask for an injunction against the syndicate." Mateo looked at the notebook. It was a weapon made of paper. "You think they will listen?" he asked. "They have to," Clara said. "But we need proof of the oil. We need to prove that the syndicate is lying about the land's value. We need to drill," Mateo said. "Yes, we need to drill." The moment of hope was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. It was late. Too late for visitors. Mateo stood up, his hand going to his gun. Clara stood with him. The door swung open without a knock. Sheriff Vance stood in the frame, flanked by two deputies. He held a paper in his hand. "Sheriff," Mateo said, his voice cold. "You are trespassing. I am serving a warrant," Vance said. He did not look happy. He looked like a man who knew he was crossing a line he could not uncross. He stepped forward and slapped the paper onto the table. "Court order," Vance said, "issued by Judge Miller this evening." "What is it?" Clara asked, reaching for the paper. "Injunction," Vance said. "Pending the investigation into the property dispute and the allegations of environmental hazard, that manure violation, the court has ordered a freeze on all operations at Rancho Soledad." He looked at Mateo. "You cannot move cattle. You cannot sell beef. You cannot pump water from the creek. And you certainly cannot dig any holes. The ranch is under state receivership until the hearing next month." "Next month," Mateo roared. "My cattle will be dead in a week. Take it up with the judge," Vance said. "I am just the messenger." He signaled to his deputies. "We will be posting guards at the gates to make sure you comply." Vance turned to leave, then paused. He looked at Clara. "If I were you, ma'am, I would take that $1,000 before the price drops again." The door closed, leaving Clara and Mateo standing in the silence. The paper on the table gleamed white in the lamplight. It was a death sentence. Mateo looked at Clara. The tenderness of the earlier moment was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly resolve. "They want to fight," he said quietly. Clara placed her hand on top of his. "Then we give them one," she said. She picked up the notebook. "Tomorrow, we go to the city. We find an honest judge, and we bring the war to them." Mateo nodded. He checked the cylinder of his revolver. "Tomorrow," he said, "outside." The wind howled through the canyon. sounding like a train coming down the tracks, unstoppable and inevitable. The road to the county seat was not a road in any civilized sense. It was a scar dragged across the geography of California, a rutted track that punished wheels and spines alike. Clara Whitlock and Mateo Reyes traveled in Mateo's buckboard wagon, the canvas cover offering scant protection against a sun that seemed determined to boil the resolve out of them. They had been on the move for 2 days. The distance between San Roque and the regional court in San Luis Obispo was measured not just in miles, but in the shifting nature of the terrain. They passed through valleys where the heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon until the mountains looked like fluid spills of ink. They crossed dry riverbeds where the stones were bleached white as bone, silent testaments to the drought that held the state by the throat. Clara sat on the wooden bench seat, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking with every jolt of the wheels. She wore a traveling veil to keep the dust from her face, but the grit found its way in, coating her tongue with the taste of earth. "We should reach the pass by noon," Mateo said. He held the reins loosely, his eyes scanning the ridgeline from habit. Even here, 50 miles from his land, he watched for threats. Clara looked at him. The profile of his face was set in stone, the scar on his jaw white against his dark skin. They were traveling together, a widow and a rancher, sleeping in separate rooms at the cheap roadhouses along the way, eating beans and stale bread by the side of the trail. To the world watching them pass, they were a scandal on wheels. To Clara, he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. They arrived in the city late on the 3rd day. San Luis Obispo was a metropolis compared to San Roque, bustling with the chaotic energy of commerce and law. Lawyers in dust-coated frock coats argued on street corners, and the air smelled of unwashed horses and ambition. They found a boarding house on the edge of town that did not ask for a marriage certificate, though the landlady gave Clara a look that could have curdled milk. Clara ignored it. She had left her shame back in the valley. Here, she carried only a satchel filled with maps and the burning coal of injustice in her chest. The next morning, they sought out the man Clara had found in the margins of the archive records. Arthur Halloway was a retired surveyor for the state, a man whose name appeared on the original geological assessments of the southern coast. They found him in a small, clutter-filled office above a bakery, surrounded by drafting tables and piles of rocks. Halloway was old, his skin like parchment, his hands trembling with a palsy that vanished the moment he touched a map. He peered at the documents Clara spread out on his table, the charred remnants from the mission, the notes from the 1850s, and the fresh sketches Mateo had made of the seep. Halloway adjusted his spectacles, humming a low, discordant tune. He ran a finger over the contour lines. "The Ojo de Brea," Halloway muttered. "I remember this. We called it the Devil's Tear back in '52. The team argued about it. Some said it was just surface runoff. I said it was a dome." "A dome?" Mateo asked, leaning forward. "An anticline," Halloway said, looking up. "Imagine a stack of dinner plates, bowed upward in the middle. The oil gets trapped in the arch. If you punch a hole in the top..." He made an exploding motion with his hands. "The syndicate knows this," Clara said. "They are buying up the land on both sides of the boundary line." Halloway nodded, his expression darkening. "They are thorough, and they are hungry. If the structure is as large as these old gravity surveys suggest, you are sitting on one of the largest fields in California." "Will you testify?" Clara asked. "We have a hearing tomorrow. We are petitioning for a protective injunction against their interference." Halloway looked at them. He saw the dust on their clothes, the exhaustion in their eyes. He saw the fragility of their position, a woman and an outsider against a corporate leviathan. "I am an old man, Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "I have no love for the trusts. They chew up the land and spit out money. Yes, I will tell the judge what the rocks say. Rocks do not lie. Men do." The hearing was held in the district courthouse, a cavernous room of polished oak and echoing silence. But the silence did not last. The Pacific Geo Trust had not been idle. They had filled the gallery with paid spectators. Men in rough clothes who whispered and snickered as Clara walked down the aisle. The judge, a man named Thornton with a beard like a gray spade, sat high on the bench. He looked bored, as if the fate of two people was a tedious interruption to his lunch. The syndicate's lawyer was not Sterling this time, but a man named Pembroke, a creature of the city with a voice like oiled silk. He did not begin with the land. He began with the people. "Your Honor," Pembroke said, pacing before the bench, "this petition is a frivolous attempt to extort legitimate business interests. And who brings this petition? A woman of questionable judgment. A woman who, by all accounts, has abandoned the propriety of her station to consort with a man of violent reputation. Objection! Clara's attorney, a nervous young man she had hired with her last few dollars, squeaked. Pembroke waved a hand dismissively. "I merely speak to credibility. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitlock claims a vast geological treasure exists on land that every official survey lists as barren scrub. She claims conspiracy where there is only commerce, and she relies on the word of Mr. Reyes, a man known in his own town as a brawler and a troublemaker. He produced a sheaf of papers. We have affidavits here. Your Honor, from the mayor of San Roque, from the sheriff, from upright citizens who testify that Mr. Reyes is unstable, that he has threatened his neighbors, and that he has exercised undue influence over the grieving widow." Clara felt the eyes of the room on her. They were stripping her naked, peeling away her dignity layer by layer. She saw Mateo gripping the railing of the witness box, his knuckles white. He was used to hatred, but he was not used to this polite, legalized assassination. When it was Clara's turn to speak, her lawyer advised her to be brief. She ignored him. She stood up, smoothing the front of her gray dress. She walked to the stand not as a victim, but as a teacher who had lost patience with unruly children. "I am not confused, Mr. Pembroke," Clara said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. "And I am not under anyone's influence. I am a woman who bought land in good faith, only to find that the seller was a phantom employed by your client." She pointed to the table where the syndicate's men sat. "You call my land barren. Yet you offered me $1,000 for it. You call Mr. Reyes violent. Yet it was his water lines that were cut. It was his cattle that were poisoned. You paint us as immoral because you cannot defeat us on the facts." Pembroke smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. "Do you have proof of these poisonings? Of these cut lines? Or are these just the hysterical imaginings of a lonely woman seeking excitement?" The laughter from the gallery was a physical blow. Clara stood trembling, not with fear, but with a rage so pure it felt like light. "I have the truth," she said, "and the truth does not need your permission to exist." Then it was Mateo's turn. He sat in the chair, looking too big for the space. Pembroke circled him like a shark. "Is it true, Mr. Reyes, that you were arrested in 1885 for assault?" "I was defending my brother," Mateo said, his voice a low rumble. "Is it true you have refused reasonable offers to sell your land, holding out for extortionate sums?" "I do not sell my home," Mateo said. Pembroke leaned in. "And what is your relationship with Mrs. Whitlock? Do you sleep in the same house?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sordid. Mateo looked at Clara. He saw the pain in her eyes, the humiliation, and he made a choice. He would not play their game. "I sleep in the barn when she is at the ranch," Mateo said clearly, "because men like you hire cowards to burn houses in the night. I protect her because your law does not." A few people in the gallery stopped laughing. There was a ring of iron in his voice that silenced the snickers. Judge Thornton looked up from his papers, studying Mateo for the first time with something other than boredom. Holloway, the surveyor, took the stand last. He spoke of anticlines and tar seeps. He laid out the science. Pembroke tried to discredit him as senile, but Holloway's expertise was a fortress. When the hearing ended, there was no gavel bang of victory. Judge Thornton rubbed his temples. "I will take this under advisement," he said. "I am ordering a temporary stay on any land transfers until a court-appointed surveyor can review the site. But I am warning you, Mrs. Whitlock. Mr. Reyes. If this is a fabrication, I will hold you in contempt. It was not a win, but it was not a loss. It was a delay. They walked out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon. Pembroke was waiting for them on the steps. He lit a cigar, blowing the smoke in their direction. "You bought yourself a few weeks," he said, "but the price of poker just went up. Do not think we will stop. Accidents happen in the oil business every day." Mateo stepped forward, but Clara put a hand on his chest. "We are leaving," she said. The drive back to San Roque was silent, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of soldiers returning to the front. The West stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, but the distance between them had closed. They arrived at the Rancho Soledad 2 days later. At dusk, the gate was open. That was the first sign. Mateo whipped the horses into a run. They clattered into the yard, dust flying. The front door of the ranch house was hanging off its hinges. Clara jumped down before the wagon stopped completely. She ran inside. The house had been gutted. Furniture was overturned. Mattresses slashed. The stuffing scattered like snow. The kitchen shelves had been pulled down, shattering the crockery. But the worst was in the small study where Clara had kept her books. They were torn apart, pages ripped from bindings, inkwells smashed against the wall. Her satchel of notes, the duplicate copies she had wisely left behind, was gone. They did not just search, Clara whispered, stepping over the ruin of a Shakespeare volume. They punished. Mateo stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark and terrifying. He did not speak. He walked to the fireplace, where a family portrait, an old daguerreotype of his parents, lay smashed on the hearth. He picked it up, brushing the glass from the image. "They want us to run," he said. Later that evening, a boy from town rode up to the fence. He did not come close. He threw a letter onto the ground and rode away as if the devil were chasing him. Clara retrieved it. It was from the school board. Mrs. Whitlock. It read, "In light of recent public disclosures regarding your moral conduct and your association with criminal elements, the board finds you unfit to instruct the youth of San Roque. Your position is terminated, effective immediately. You have 24 hours to vacate the schoolhouse lodgings." Clara read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She looked at the wrecked house. She looked at Mateo, who was nailing the front door back onto its frame by the light of a lantern. She had no job. She had no home. She had no reputation. Mateo turned to her. He saw the letter in her hand. He knew what it meant. "You can stay here," he said. Clara looked at him. "If I stay here," she said, "they will say everything Pembroke said is true. They will say I am your woman." Mateo drove a nail into the wood with a single, violent blow of the hammer. "Let them say it," he said. "They have taken everything else. Do not let them take your safety." So Clara moved in, not into the barn, and not into the guest room, for the guest room bed was destroyed. She took the small cot from the bunkhouse and set it up in the corner of the main room, near the hearth. The town buzzed like a disturbed hive. The widow Whitlock, living in sin with the Mexican rancher. It was delicious. It was scandalous. It was the final proof of her depravity. But inside the ranch house, the reality was far from the salacious rumors. It was a life of quiet, desperate domesticity. They fell into a routine born of survival. Clara cooked simple meals over the open fire: beans, tortillas, dried beef. Mateo worked the ranch from dawn until dusk, carrying his rifle everywhere. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, planning. They needed to drill. The judge had paused land transfers, but he had not explicitly forbidden testing on their own property, provided they did not sell the oil. If they could bring in a sample, a flowing, undeniable sample, before the court surveyor arrived, the syndicate's claim that the land was barren would be destroyed forever. They decided to build a spring pole rig. It was an ancient, back-breaking method of drilling, using a green sapling as a spring to lift a heavy iron bit, which was then dropped repeatedly to punch through the rock. It was slow. It was grueling. But it did not require steam engines or hired crews they could not afford. The intimacy between them grew in the spaces between the work. It was in the way Mateo poured her coffee in the morning, making sure she got the first cup. It was in the way Clara mended his torn shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. It was in the silence that was no longer awkward, but companionable. One night, a week after the hearing, the wind was howling around the eaves, rattling the shutters. They had finished a dinner of stew. Mateo was cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp and metallic. Clara watched him. She watched the way his hands moved, sure and capable. She looked at the scar on his jaw, the one Pembroke had tried to use as a weapon. Mateo. She said. He looked up. Why did they arrest you? In '85, Pembroke said it was assault. You said you were defending your brother. Mateo set the rifle down. He looked into the fire. My brother, Lucas, he was 18. He was spirited. He liked to dance. There was a girl at the Harvest Festival, a white girl. She smiled at him. He smiled back. That was all. He paused, his jaw tightening. 3 men followed him out of town. They dragged him off his horse. They were beating him with fence posts when I found them. I did not ask questions. I broke the arm of the first man. I broke the jaw of the second. The third ran. He touched the scar on his own face. The sheriff came the next day. Not for them, for me. They said Lucas had attacked the girl. They said I was a mad dog, the vigilantes. They took me from the cell before the trial. They dragged me behind a horse for a mile. They wanted me to learn my place. Clara felt a cold horror settle in her stomach. She reached out and touched his arm. The muscle beneath the shirt was hard as iron. They did not kill me, Mateo said softly, because they wanted me to live with the shame. They wanted me to be the warning. Look at Mateo Reyes. Look what happens when you forget who you are. He turned his eyes to her. They were dark and full of an old, deep pain. That is why I stay apart. Clara, that is why I did not want you involved. My name is poison in this valley. Clara moved her hand down his arm until her fingers interlaced with his. Your name is not poison, she said fiercely. It is the only name in this valley that means anything to me. You fought for your brother. You are fighting for me. That is not shame. Mateo, that is honor. Mateo looked at their joined hands. The contrast of her pale skin against his dark hand was stark. In the world outside, this touch was a crime. In this room, it was the only truth that mattered. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his cheek, covering the scar. I do not want you to be a warning, he whispered. I am not a warning, Clara said. I am a partner. The word hung between them, heavy with promise. They did not kiss that night. The weight of the story was too heavy for romance. But they sat together until the fire burned down to embers. 2 outcasts building a fortress out of trust. The drilling began 3 days later. They chose a spot in the hidden ravine, near the seep. They cut a 20-foot sapling and rigged the fulcrum. Mateo forged a crude chisel bit in the ranch smithy. It was brutal work. Mateo would pull the rope, bending the sapling, lifting the heavy iron bit. Then he would release it, slamming the steel into the rock. Thud, thud, thud. Clara worked the baler, a hollow tube used to scoop out the pulverized rock and water. She was covered in mud, her hands raw, her back aching, but with every foot they went down, the smell of petroleum grew stronger. At 40 feet, they hit gas, a hiss of escaping vapor that made them dizzy. We are close, Mateo said, wiping sweat from his eyes. Maybe 10 more feet, but the syndicate was watching. On the 4th day of drilling, Clara went back to the ranch house to fetch supplies. Mateo stayed at the rig, working the bit alone. He was in the rhythm of it. Pull, drop, pull, drop. When he heard a snap, it wasn't a twig. It was the sound of metal failing under stress. He looked up. The heavy iron pulley block that held the cable at the top of the tripod was swinging loose. The bolt had sheared. He had checked that bolt that morning. It was solid steel. Mateo tried to jump back, but the heavy cable lashed out like a whip. The iron block, 50 pounds of dead weight, came crashing down. It struck the side of his head with a sickening crunch. Mateo crumbled The world spun into a vortex of gray and black. He fell across the hole, his blood mingling with the dark, oily mud. Clara heard the crash from the ridge. It echoed like thunder. "Mateo!" she screamed. She dropped the water pails and ran. She scrambled down the slope, sliding on the shale, tearing her dress. She found him lying still, the heavy block resting near his shoulder. The side of his head was bleeding profusely. "Mateo!" She fell to her knees, her hands frantically searching for a pulse. It was there, thready and weak. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were unfocused. "The bolt," he mumbled, his speech slurring. "They cut the bolt." Clara looked up at the tripod. She saw the sheared metal. It was a clean cut, filed halfway through so it would fail under load. It was not an accident. It was an execution. She looked around the canyon. The silence was absolute, but she felt them, the eyes watching from the rim. The men who had done this. Panic clawed at her throat, but she shoved it down. She could not panic. If she panicked, he died. She tore the hem of her petticoat and pressed the cloth against his wound. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice shaking. "Do not you dare leave me." Mateo Reyes. She had to get him to the wagon. She had to get him to a doctor. But the doctor was in town. The town that hated them. The town that was waiting for them to die. Clara looked at Mateo's blood on her hands. She looked at the black earth they had fought for. She realized then that the law would not save them. The courts would not save them. The only thing that would save them was the ferocious, unyielding will to survive. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and began to drag him. She was a schoolteacher. She was small, but in that moment, she was made of the same iron as the drill bit. She dragged him inch by agonizing inch up the slope, cursing the syndicate, cursing the town, cursing the God that would allow this. She would not let him die, and if he lived, she would burn their world to the ground. The bandage around Mateo's head was a stark white band against his skin, a constant reminder of the inch that separated him from the grave. He sat in the high-backed chair by the hearth, cleaning his rifle with movements that were slower than usual, but no less precise. It had been 3 days since the pulley block crashed down, 3 days since Clara had dragged him from the canyon floor with a strength born of terror. He was alive, but the war was not over. The silence of the night was broken not by the wind, but by a scream. It came from the bunkhouse, a sharp, terrified sound that cut through the heavy timber of the main house. Mateo was on his feet instantly, the pain in his skull ignored, the rifle in his hand. Clara, who had been dozing in the chair opposite him, was only a second behind. Grabbing the lantern, they ran out into the yard. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds, turning the ranch into a landscape of shadows. By the time they reached the bunkhouse, the attackers were gone, leaving only the sound of galloping hooves fading into the dark. Inside, they found Pedro, the youngest of the ranch hands, writhing on the floor. His face was a mask of blood. He had been sleeping when they came. They had not used guns. They had used clubs. Mateo knelt beside the boy, his face twisting in a fury that was more terrifying than the violence itself. "They told me to leave," Pedro gasped, spitting blood. "They said, next time. They burn it all." Clara brought water and towels, her hands steady despite the shaking of her heart. She cleaned the boy's wounds, a broken nose, a fractured rib, cuts that would scar. "They are not trying to scare us anymore," Mateo said, his voice low and vibrating with the recoil of his rage. "They are trying to kill the help, so we are alone." He stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the empty, hostile dark. "They want us isolated. They want us to bleed out." Clara finished binding Pedro's ribs. She stood and walked to Mateo. She placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, tight as a drawn bowstring. "Then we do not let them isolate us," she said. "We bind ourselves so tight that they cannot cut the knot." The next morning, the kitchen table became a war room. The coffee was strong and bitter, matching the mood. "We have a problem of standing," Clara said. She had spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking through the labyrinth of laws that trap them. The court sees me as a foolish widow with a disputed deed. They see you as a hostile neighbor. As long as we are separate, they can pick us off. They can compel me to testify against you regarding the boundary. They can claim our partnership is an illicit conspiracy to defraud the investors. Mateo looked at her. The bandage was still on his head, but his eyes were clear. What are you proposing? A merger? Clara said. She took a breath. A legal merger. Under the laws of California, property held in common by a married couple is protected differently. It becomes community property. One spouse cannot easily sell or be coerced into selling without the consent of the other. And, more importantly, a wife cannot be compelled to testify against her husband in criminal proceedings. Mateo went still. He looked at the mug in his hands. Marriage, he said. It is the only shield we have left. Clara said, it formalizes our alliance. It validates my presence in this house to the moralizers in town. And it tells the syndicate that to take the land, they have to go through both of us, united. She waited. The air in the room was thick. This was not a proposal of romance. It was a tactical maneuver. Or at least, that was what they were pretending. Mateo looked up. Do you know what you are asking? He said. To marry me is to paint a target on your back that will never wash off. You will not just be the widow who made a bad deal. You will be the wife of the half-breed. You will be a pariah. If we lose this, if they win, you will have nothing. No reputation. No future back east. You will be chained to a ruined man. Clara reached across the table. She took his hand. I am already a pariah, Mateo, and I am already chained to this land. She squeezed his fingers. I am not afraid of the target. I am afraid of losing. I am afraid of them winning because we were too proud to do what was necessary. Mateo turned his hand over, gripping hers. We do not do this for love, he said, his voice rough. We do this for war. Clara looked him in the eye. For war. She agreed. But as she said it, she knew it was a lie. And looking at him, she knew he knew it too. They were married 2 days later by a circuit judge in a dusty office in San Luis Obispo. There were no flowers. There were no guests. Clara wore her gray traveling dress. Mateo wore a clean shirt and his dark coat. When they said the words, they did not look at the judge. They looked at each other, their gazes locking with a ferocity that startled the official. I do, Mateo said, and it sounded like a threat to the world. When they signed the certificate, the ink was barely dry before Clara began the next phase of the offensive. She did not go back to the ranch immediately. She went to the offices of the Sierra Gazette, a newspaper known for its populist leanings and its editor, a man named Horace Albright who had a well-documented hatred for the railway trusts. Clara placed her dossier on Albright's desk. It was thick with dates, names, and the charred maps from the mission. This is not a story about a land dispute. Clara told him, this is a story about the Pacific Geo Trust systematically defrauding the state of California, falsifying geological surveys, and using violence to suppress independent landowners. Albright, a man with ink-stained cuffs and a cynical eye, thumbed through the pages. He stopped at the copy of the mission map. You can prove the syndicate knew about the oil before the sale, he asked. I can prove their agent, Elias Thorne, is on their payroll, Clara said. I have telegraph records linking him to their San Francisco office. I can prove they sold me the land to hide the asset, and now they are trying to kill us to get it back. Albright looked at her. If I print this, they will come for you with the lawyers. Maybe worse. They are already coming for us with worse. Clara said, I want the light on them. I want the cockroaches to scurry. Albright grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. I have a press run at 4 o'clock. The story hit San Roque 3 days later. It was not a ripple, it was a boulder dropped in a pond. The headline screamed, Blood for Oil, the secret war in San Roque. Copies were nailed to the post office door. Men read them in the saloon. The whispers that had been malicious gossip turned into shocked murmurs. The town, so ready to judge the widow, now saw themselves reflected in the corruption. If the syndicate could do this to her, who was safe? The reaction from the syndicate was swift and vicious. Frederick Sterling arrived at the ranch the next afternoon. He did not come alone. He brought Sheriff Vance and 2 deputies. They stopped at the gate, which Mateo had reinforced with heavy timber. Mateo walked out to meet them. He did not carry a rifle this time. He walked with his hands empty, but his stride was heavy with purpose. Clara walked beside him, her head high. Mrs. Reyes, Sterling said, testing the new name with a sneer. I see you have been busy, slandering reputable businessmen in the rag sheets. I only told the truth. Mr. Sterling, Clara said, does the truth sting? Sterling's face was tight. We are done playing, he said. The sheriff is here to serve a notice of condemnation. The county is seizing the access road under the Public Safety Act. Your fence is obstructing a municipal thoroughfare. It is a private road, Mateo said. On my land. Not anymore, Vance said, stepping forward. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes shifting away from Mateo's stare. The council voted this morning. Eminent domain. We are tearing down the gate. Mateo stood before the timber barrier. You will not touch this gate. Sterling nodded to the deputies. Arrest him. Obstruction of justice. The deputies moved forward, hands on their holsters. This was the trap. If Mateo fought, he was a criminal. If he surrendered, the gate came down, and the syndicate's trucks would roll in to seize the drill site. Mateo did not draw a weapon. He simply stood his ground, a wall of flesh and bone. I'm asking you to stop, Mateo said to Vance. You know this is wrong. Jim, you know they are paying you to break the law. Vance hardened his jaw. Move aside, Mateo. One of the deputies, a hired gun new to the town, lost his patience. He swung his baton, aiming for Mateo's injured head. Mateo blocked the blow with his forearm, the sound of wood on bone sharp in the silence. He shoved the deputy back. That was the spark. The deputy drew his revolver. No, Clara screamed. Mateo moved with a speed that belied his size. He grabbed the deputy's wrist, twisting the gun away, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The deputy went down in the dust. The second deputy leveled his gun. Warning shot, Vance yelled. The gun went off. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from Clara's boot. Mateo froze. He looked at the dust where the bullet had struck, then at the man holding the gun. The violence in his eyes was so absolute that the deputy took a step back. But before the slaughter could begin, a voice rang out from the road. Hold your fire! A buggy came careening down the track, dust billowing behind it. It was driven by a man in a dusty suit, the attorney Clara had found in San Luis Obispo, Mr. Darrow. He jumped from the buggy, waving a paper with a blue wax seal. Emergency injunction, Darrow shouted. Running toward the gate, issued by the District Court of Appeals this morning. He shoved the paper into the sheriff's chest. This order supersedes the municipal council. It freezes all actions regarding the Reyes-Whitlock property, including condemnation proceedings, pending a state investigation into fraud. If you touch that gate, Sheriff, you will be held in federal contempt. Vance looked at the paper. He looked at Sterling. This is garbage. Sterling spat. It is a court order, Vance said, and the relief in his voice was audible. He holstered his gun. I am not going to federal prison for you. Sterling. Sterling looked at Clara and Mateo. He saw the wall they had built. He saw the lawyer. He saw the defeat. This is not over, he hissed. Get off my land, Mateo said. Sterling turned his horse and rode away, the dust of his departure bitter in the air. That night, the adrenaline crash left them both shaking. The ranch was quiet. The deputies were gone. The gate still stood. Clara stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. She felt a trembling in her legs that would not stop. It was the bullet, the inch of dirt that had saved her life. Mateo came up behind her. He did not speak. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. They stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of each other. Dust, sweat, fear, and life. I thought he was going to kill you, Mateo whispered against her skin. When that gun went off, he turned her around. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. You are my wife, he said. The word was no longer a legal term. It was a vow. It was a claiming. Clara looked up at him. She saw the man who had stood unarmed against a gun for her. She saw the partner who had pulled her from the wreckage of her own mistakes. "I am your wife," she answered. The kiss that followed was not like the first one in the barn. That had been a collision. This was a surrender. It was fierce and deep, fueled by the terrifying realization that they belonged to each other completely. Mateo lifted her, sitting her on the edge of the sturdy oak table. His hands moved over her, desperate to confirm that she was whole, that she was real. Clara pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, the roughness of his coat against her arms grounding her. They did not make it to the bedroom. In the flickering light of the kitchen hearth, amidst the maps and the legal papers that littered the table, they consummated the marriage that had begun as a lie and ended as the only truth they had left. It was an act of defiance against the death that stalked them, a reclaiming of the joy the world tried to deny them. Later, lying together on the rug before the dying fire, wrapped in a blanket, the silence was peaceful. "We won," Clara whispered. "We survived," Mateo corrected, kissing the top of her head. "Winning comes later. The victory, however, was already in motion." 2 days later, the sound of a heavy engine echoed up the valley. It was not the syndicate. A caravan of wagons arrived, bearing the seal of the State of California Geological Survey. Men in official uniforms began to unload equipment. They were accompanied by 2 Texas Rangers, hired by the state to ensure the peace. The lead investigator, a man named Colonel Harris, rode up to the porch where Clara and Mateo stood waiting. "Mr. and Mrs. Reyes?" Harris asked. "We are," Mateo said. "We have a warrant to conduct a geological assessment of the boundary line," Harris said. "Based on evidence provided to the Attorney General regarding potential fraud by the Pacific Geo Trust." He looked toward the ridge. "If there is oil down there, folks, we are going to find it. And if there is, the state is going to want to know why a certain corporation tried so hard to hide it." As the surveyors began their work, hiking up the trail to the Ojo de Brea, a rumor began to drift back from the telegraph office in town. The stock of the Pacific Geo Trust had dropped 10 points in San Francisco. The investors were panicking. And in the saloon, the men who had shunned Mateo and mocked Clara began to talk differently. They talked about the oil. They talked about the massive dome that lay under the ridge. And they whispered that if the drill hit, the widow Whitlock, no, Mrs. Reyes, and the rancher would be the richest people in the valley. Clara and Mateo stood on the porch, watching the state men climb their hill. "They are going to drill," Clara said. "Let them drill," Mateo said. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into his side. "We know what is there." Clara looked at the land. It was still harsh, it was still dry, but it looked different now. It didn't look like a trap, it looked like a future. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that whatever came out of that ground, black gold or salt water, they would face it standing together. The arrival of Colonel Harris and the state geological team did not bring immediate peace to San Roque. It brought a suffocating, static tension, like the air before a lightning strike. The town was occupied territory now, caught between the entrenched power of the Pacific Geo Trust and the slow, grinding machinery of the California Attorney General's office. The syndicate knew its window was closing. Frederick Sterling, stripped of his smooth veneer, moved through the town like a trapped wolf. He knew that if the survey confirmed the anticline, the fraud would be undeniable. He needed to break the chain of evidence, and the weakest link, in his estimation, was the man he had already painted as a villain. On the second night of the investigation, a shadow moved near the back of the livery stable where the state team had stored their equipment. A fire here would destroy the theodolites and the transit levels, delaying the survey for weeks. Weeks that Sterling could use to maneuver. But he needed a scapegoat. Sheriff Vance, sweating and pale, was dispatched to the Rancho Soledad with a warrant for Mateo's arrest. The charge was conspiracy to commit arson. The evidence was a crate of dynamite allegedly found in Mateo's buckboard wagon, a crate that had been placed there by one of Sterling's own men an hour before. Vance rode up to the ranch house at midnight, accompanied by 4 deputies, but they did not find a sleeping house. They found the yard illuminated by lanterns. Mateo stood on the porch. Beside him stood Colonel Harris, smoking a pipe, and flanking them were 2 Texas Rangers, their badges glinting in the lantern light. "Sheriff," Harris said, his voice calm and dry as the dust. "You are out late. I have a warrant," Vance stammered, pulling his horse up short. "We found explosives. This man is planning to sabotage the state inquiry." Harris took the pipe from his mouth and tapped the ash onto the porch rail. "Is that so?" Harris asked. "That is fascinating, Sheriff, because Mr. Reyes has been sitting here with me for the last 4 hours, discussing the history of the land grant, and his wagon has been in the barn, under the guard of my Rangers, since sundown." Vance looked at the Rangers. He looked at Mateo, whose face was a mask of cold judgment. He realized, with a sinking terror, that he had walked into a wall he could not climb. "If there is dynamite in that wagon, Sheriff," Harris continued, "then someone else put it there. And I think we should find out who. The frame-up collapsed before it could begin. The clumsiness of the attempt only sharpened the investigators' appetite for the truth." The next morning, the battle moved from the shadows to the parlor of the town's hotel, which Harris had commandeered as a temporary hearing room. Sterling sat at one table, his lawyers flanking him like vultures. Clara and Mateo sat at the other. Clara placed her satchel on the table. She opened it, not with anger, but with the precision of a surgeon preparing to cut. She laid out the dossier. "Here is the original deed," Clara said, her voice clear in the hushed room. "Here is the correspondence from the man calling himself Elias Thorne, postmarked from the same building in San Francisco that houses the Pacific Geo Trust. Here's the affidavit from the clerk in the county archive, admitting he was paid $20 to misfile the 1852 survey." Sterling's lawyer stood up. "This is circumstantial," he objected. Clara did not look at him. She pulled out the final piece of evidence, the scorched map from the mission, preserved between 2 sheets of glass. "And here," Clara said, "is the proof that you knew. You knew about the Ojo de Brea. You knew the dome ran under Lot 7. You sold me the land to hide the asset from your competitors, intending to steal it back once you had forced Mr. Reyes off his ranch. You did not sell me worthless rock. Mr. Sterling, you sold me the treasury of California, and you tried to kill us to get it back." Harris leaned forward, examining the map. He looked at the Spanish script. He looked at the notes. He turned to Sterling. "This map matches the preliminary data my men brought down from the ridge this morning." Harris said, "The structure is there." Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "It is a forgery." "It is history," Harris corrected. "And it seems, Mr. Sterling, that you are on the wrong side of it." The unraveling was swift. The survey was completed 3 days later. The state engineers confirmed what Holloway had seen and what the old friars had noted: a massive geological anticline. An arch of rock trapping a sea of oil ran directly beneath the boundary line of the Reyes Ranch and Clara's Strip. The land was not just valuable, it was strategic. It was the cork in the bottle. With the geological truth established, the legal house of cards built by the syndicate fell apart. The Attorney General issued indictments for fraud and conspiracy. Sheriff Vance was suspended pending a corruption inquiry. He turned in his badge without a word, walking out of the office a diminished man. Councilman Pruitt, the banker who had sneered at Clara, attempted to board the northbound train with a suitcase full of bank bonds. He was apprehended at the station by the Rangers. The town of San Roque watched the mighty fall. The structures of power they had assumed were absolute. The bank, the law, the company were revealed to be rotten, and the people they had ostracized, the widow and the outsider, were the ones holding the hammer. The social prejudice did not vanish overnight. Decades of learned bias are not erased by a single court ruling. But the silence in the street changed. It was no longer a silence of contempt. It was a silence of reckoning. Men touched the brims of their hats when Matteo rode past. It was not friendship, but it was respect. The respect due to a man who had stood in the fire and not burned. Clara went to the schoolhouse one last time. The school board, sensing the shift in the wind, had sent a messenger that morning. They offered to reinstate her position, citing a misunderstanding of the facts. Clara walked into the classroom. The dust motes danced in the light, just as they always had. She ran her hand over the desks. She had loved this work. She had loved the idea of building a future for other people's children. But she had a different future to build now. The head of the school board, a grocer named Higgins, met her at the door. "Mrs. Reyes," Higgins said, smiling nervously. "We are so glad you reconsidered. The children have missed you. We are willing to overlook the unorthodoxy of your recent marriage." Clara looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes. He was not welcoming her back because he valued her. He was welcoming her back because she was now the co-owner of the most valuable land in the county. "I did not come to teach. Mr. Higgins," Clara said, "I came to collect my books." Higgins blinked. "But the position, it is yours." "No," Clara said. "It was mine when I was desperate. It was mine when you thought I was weak. You do not get to claim me now that I am strong." She packed her slate and her volumes of poetry into a box. She walked to the door and turned back. "My husband and I will be building a school on our land," Clara said. "A school that accepts all children, Mexican, American, rich, poor. You are welcome to send your students there, Mr. Higgins, if they are willing to learn from the unorthodoxy." She walked out, leaving him standing in the empty room. Back at the ranch, the mood was one of industrious chaos. The lawful drilling permit had arrived, stamped with the seal of the state. Matteo had not hired the syndicate's crews. Instead, he had sent word to the neighboring smallholders, the men who had been squeezed by the trust, the ranchers who had lost water rights, the farmers who had been bullied. They came with wagons, with tools, with strong backs. They saw the fight at Rancho Soledad not as a business venture, but as a stand. If Matteo Reyes could beat the trust, maybe they could too. They built the rig. It was a cable tool rig, powered by a steam engine Matteo had salvaged and repaired. It was a noisy, clanking beast of iron and wood, sitting over the hole where Matteo had nearly died. The drilling was slow. Days turned into weeks. The rhythmic thud, hiss-thud of the bit became the heartbeat of the ranch. Clara and Matteo worked alongside the men. Clara managed the logistics, feeding the crew, tracking the depth, managing the water supply. Matteo worked the steam engine, his hands permanently stained with grease. There was no romance in it. It was loud, dangerous, filthy work. But in the evenings, when the engine was silenced, they sat on the porch, listening to the cooling metal tick in the dark. "Do you think it is really there?" Clara asked one night, looking at the stars. "It is there," Matteo said. "The earth does not lie. Only men do." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was solid. They were no longer two lonely people clinging to each other for survival. They were a single entity, forged in the crucible. The strike happened on a Tuesday, at 2 in the afternoon. There was no warning rumble. There was just a sudden, violent hiss, like a steam locomotive venting pressure. The men on the platform shouted and scrambled back. The walking beam of the rig shuddered, and then, with a roar that shook the ground, the column of black fluid shot into the sky. It did not look like gold. It looked like a monster. It sprayed over the top of the derrick, coating the men, the ground, and the sky in a slick, dark rain. The smell was overpowering. Sulfur and raw earth. "Oil!" one of the hands screamed. Matteo ran to the shutoff valve. He fought the pressure, the oil blinding him, making the wheel slippery. "Cap it!" he roared. "We have to cap it before the gas ignites." It was messy. It was terrifying. It was not a moment of pure joy. It was a moment of managing a chaotic force. Clara ran with blankets to smother the firebox of the steam engine, preventing a spark that could turn the victory into an inferno. When they finally managed to close the valve, diverting the flow into the holding tanks they had built, Silence fell over the canyon. They stood there, dripping with oil. They looked like statues carved from obsidian. The men cheered. They threw their hats in the air, but Clara and Mateo just looked at each other. They saw the black stains on their skin. They saw the reality of what they had unleashed. "This changes everything," Clara said, wiping the oil from her eyes. "Yes," Mateo said. "Now the real trouble begins." The trouble did come, but it was a different kind. It was the trouble of success. Money flowed. Not a trickle, but a river. The syndicate, defeated in court, had no choice but to negotiate for the rights to transport the oil. Other companies came calling. The town of San Roque transformed. A spur line was built. New stores opened. But Clara and Mateo did not move to a mansion in San Francisco. They stayed in the adobe ranch house. They grappled with the moral weight of their sudden power. They saw how the oil industry worked elsewhere. Men treated like mules, paid in scrip, discarded when they were broken. "We will not be them," Mateo said one night, looking at a contract from a refinery. They established a wage for their workers that was double the territory standard. They built bunkhouses with real beds and heating. They hired a doctor to visit the site weekly. When the other oil barons complained that the Reyes-Whitlock operation was ruining the labor market, Mateo simply replied, "We are buying loyalty. You are buying enemies." They signaled a commitment to justice over vengeance. When the town council came, hat in hand, asking for a donation for a new town hall, Clara agreed, on the condition that the hall be open to all, regardless of race or creed. But the old enemy had one last gasp. Frederick Sterling, free on bail and facing a prison sentence, could not let it go. His ego was a bruised thing that demanded blood. He paid 2 drifters to plant a charge at the main holding tank. He wanted to see the black gold burn. He wanted to see Mateo Reyes ash. But the era of private terror was over. The state deputies, still stationed at the ranch to monitor the transition, saw the men creeping through the brush. There was no shootout. There was no dramatic duel. The deputies simply surrounded the men, rifles raised. "Drop it," the sergeant ordered. The drifters dropped the dynamite. They gave up Sterling's name in exchange for a lighter sentence before they even reached the jailhouse. Sterling was arrested at the train station, trying to flee to Mexico. When they led him away in handcuffs, he looked toward the ridge, toward the black towers of the derricks rising against the sky. He saw the future, and he saw that he was not part of it. The final victory was not the oil. It was the quiet morning a month later. Clara and Mateo rode out to the boundary line. The old fence was gone. In its place was a road that connected the ranch to the wells. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of apricot and violet. The air was cool and clean, the smell of the oil faint in the distance. They stopped their horses at the marker stone, the place where Clara had once stood and thrown rocks in despair, the place where Mateo had first stopped to warn her about the snakes. Clara looked at the land. It was scarred by industry now. There were roads, tanks, pipes. It was no longer the wild, silent place it had been, but it was theirs. She looked at Mateo. The scar on his jaw was still there, but the tension that had defined him for so long was gone. He sat easy in the saddle, a man who no longer had to apologize for his existence. "We did it," Clara said softly. Mateo nodded. He reached out and took her hand. "We did not just find the oil. Clara," he said, "we found the line, and we erased it." Clara squeezed his hand. She thought of the journey, the shame of the swindle, the heat of the ridge, the terror of the nights, the fierce, desperate love that had grown in the cracks of their survival. She realized that the treasure was not the black dome beneath their feet. The treasure was the man sitting beside her. The treasure was the dignity of being able to choose their own life. "What do we do now?" Clara asked. Mateo looked at the horizon, where the new day was breaking over the changing west. The world was moving faster now. The open range was closing. The machines were coming, but they were ready. "We live," Mateo said. "We just live." They turned their horses toward the home they had defended, riding side by side, not as widow and outcast, but as kings of their own dust. crossing the threshold into a future they had carved with their own hands. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and resilience of the American frontier, and I hope Clara and Mateo's fight for dignity resonated with you. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of love, survival, and the history of the frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.